betrayed, arrested, denied, abandoned. Before the scourging and crucifixion, Jesus undergoes a suffering that some may say is even more painful than the physical. He is emotionally devastated. Welcome back to the Bible Paladin as we continue our study of Mark's Gospel. We begin with Jesus and his disciples arriving at Gethsemane right after celebrating their Passover together, a ritual meal in which Jesus establishes a new ritual with his disciples, one that they don't yet understand. But now he takes them to a familiar place to enter into prayer, a secluded grove of olive trees, a garden where olives are harvested and pressed to produce oil that would be used to improve meals, but also historically to anoint kings, prophets, and priests. Jesus invites his followers to pray with him, to prepare, to watch, as he himself is trampled upon and pressed emotionally. And here we begin to see the true loneliness and fear of the Christ. And so I invite you to pray and read with me as we listen to these words. They went to a place called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." He took Peter, James, and John along with him, and he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death," he said to them. "Stay here and keep watch." Going a little farther, he fell to the ground and prayed that if possible, the hour might pass from him. "Abba, Father," he said, "everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will." Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. "Simon," he said to Peter, "are you asleep? Couldn't you keep watch for 1 hour? Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." Once more he went away and prayed the same thing. When he came back, he again found them sleeping, because their eyes were heavy. They did not know what to say to him. Returning the third time, he said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Enough! The hour has come. Look, the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer." As I had alluded to before, where they had prayed in Gethsemane was most likely a private olive grove, for Gethsemane means olive press, and it's possible that some of the followers of Jesus, those in Jerusalem, may have owned this olive place and allowed Jesus and his disciples to come there as a place of retreat and prayer. And so Jesus calls the three closest to him, Peter, James, and John, to come pray with him. He wants companionship at what he knows is going to be one of his darkest hours. Before Jesus falls to the ground in prayer, he asks his disciples to pray and keep watch. And he uses a word which means to stay awake, to be alert. And this echoes what he said previously on the Mount of Olives when he was talking about the destruction of the temple. But now he is talking about what is going to happen to himself when the temple of his own body will be pierced and destroyed in a sense. And so he is finally asking his disciples to keep watch with him. And once again, they fail. I mean, to be fair, they just walked from the southwest side of Jerusalem to the northeast and across the Kidron Valley. Not to mention, each would have probably drank about 4 cups of wine during the meal. But Jesus did ask them to pray and keep watch 3 times. But moving on from the failure of the apostles, let's take a closer look at the ordeal or agony of Jesus. Mark tells us that Jesus was amazed and distressed. Because that sounds contradictory, we have various translations in different versions of the Bible, but most with something similar to troubled and distressed. The Greek word in question is, and I know I'm going to mess this pronunciation up, but ekthambistai, which we only see in Mark. It is best understood as amazed or awestruck. So it could have a similar meaning to being terrified. It was an indication of a strong emotion. And Jesus tells those that he is with that his soul is sorrowful. It is grieved. And so Jesus is considering what is about to happen. And there's some indication of what this looks like by looking at the prayer that he is about to say. Prayer speaks volumes as we look at its parts. It begins with Abba, Father. And whether Jesus said Father twice or Mark was just translating the Aramaic word Abba for us is unclear. But Abba wasn't just a word for father, it was also what a child would call his father, kind of like daddy. I remember some years ago when I was in Israel, I remember seeing a little boy running up to his dad saying, "Abba, Abba," before his father came and snatched him up into his arms. And I couldn't help but think of this verse. It portrays a sense of trust and intimacy. And then Jesus reaffirms the power of God, that all things are possible. A traditional Jewish way of starting a prayer, speaking of the power and grandeur of God. Then he makes his request, "Take this cup away from me." Remember when he asked James and John if they could drink the same cup that he would drink from? And now Jesus is asking himself the same question. Can I drink this cup? Can I endure the pain and suffering that is about to happen to me? Of course, Jesus knew the answer to his prayer. He concludes by saying, "Not what I will, but what you will." As the Son, he was obedient to the Father, no matter the cost. And we are told that he prays this 3 times. Each time he looks to his closest friends for support, but they offer none. They could not keep watch with him. Not even those who said they could drink from the same cup that he drinks from. They are not yet ready. Sleep and death are close siblings. And at this point, the disciples have not yet received that spirit of life that they will need to continue on with their ministry. At this point, they're simply not ready. It is telling that Jesus calls Peter Simon instead of the name that he has given him, and he tells him to pray that he will not fall into temptation. Yet as willing and headstrong as Simon is, he still fails. He is not yet Cephas. He still must undergo and realize his failure before he can be redeemed. The 3rd time that Jesus approaches them, he rouses them to get up, and not only announces that his betrayer approaches, but that it will be handed over to sinners, or literally sinful men. Let's continue reading to see what happens. Just as he was speaking, Judas, one of the 12, appeared. With him was a crowd armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. "The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard." Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, "Rabbi," and kissed him. The men seized Jesus and arrested him. Then one of those standing near drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. "Am I leading a rebellion," said Jesus, "that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I was with you, teaching in your temple courts, and you did not arrest me. But the scriptures must be fulfilled." Then everyone deserted him and fled. A young man, wearing nothing but a linen garment, was following Jesus. When they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind. The arrest of Jesus opens up with a list of Jesus' enemies, and the remaining 11 do eventually desert Jesus, but at this point they are still considered part of the inner circle. In Markan fashion, we have this clear distinction between the elect and those opposed to the kingdom of God. And so those that come to arrest Jesus are Judas, one of the 12, as well as this group of armed individuals. But we are also told who sent them: the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders. For a breakdown of those in opposition to Jesus, check out this video in the description below. No one mentioned should be a surprise at this point. Jesus already told us who would betray him. The crowds have continuously been swayed and switched sides throughout the gospel, and the religious Jewish leadership have been his loudest detractors. What I do find interesting is that many people assume that Jesus was arrested by Roman soldiers, and even some older commentaries mention the presence of Roman soldiers, but they weren't there. The text simply does not mention them, at least not explicitly. Oh, I haven't done one of these in a while. So the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all talk about a crowd armed with swords and clubs that come to arrest Jesus. And it seems like they are being led by Judas, certainly not Roman soldiers. The Gospel of John, however, reads Judas, having procured a band of soldiers and some officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, went there with lanterns and torches and weapons. This certainly sounds more like a ragtag militia than a Roman detachment, and certainly not a cohort, which would be 600 men with about 480 soldiers, or even a century, which would have been about 80 soldiers. I've heard some preachers talking about hundreds of soldiers coming to arrest Jesus, and I've been to Gethsemane. It would not have been that big of a garden. And the word that John uses, the Greek word is spira, which has often been translated as cohort, but can really mean any group or band of soldiers. The most logical explanation is that they would have been some of the temple guard, since they were sent by the chief priests. The Romans would not be doing their bidding. Plus, they didn't bring Jesus to Pontius Pilate right away. They first take Jesus to the high priest, something else the Romans would not have done. So let's get back to Judas and his mob. And the sign that he uses to betray Jesus, the insult is palpable. It is a kiss, a sign of affection and friendship, trust and loyalty. And then he calls him Rabbi, which suggests that he is still his student. And Judas really doesn't understand still what Jesus is there for. What is he all about? Because he tells them to make sure that they secure him tightly, because he is afraid that Jesus is going to try to escape. Now, the other apostles, of course, don't understand either. And so one of them takes his sword, and we have the infamous ear-slicing incident. But Mark, in his brevity, really doesn't tell us too much about who it was or Jesus' reaction to it. Instead, we have Jesus' reaction to Judas and the crowd. He addresses their misconception of his role, asking whether he is leading a rebellion. Ironically, he is leading a religious and spiritual rebellion, but they can only see the physical. So after admonishing their tactics, Jesus does go willingly, and he says this all happened so that the scriptures would be fulfilled. And although we're not sure which scripture, or at least it's not said explicitly, many have suggested Isaiah 53, which prophesies a suffering Messiah. But it may be a broader statement. All that has and is about to occur is a fulfillment of all the scriptures. This is the pinnacle of God's revelation and our redemption. The next few lines go hand in hand. Verse 50 tells us that everyone deserted him and fled. What an ominous and final statement. Everyone. As Jesus enters into his lowest point, where he's going into his mockery, his trial, his suffering and pain, everyone deserts him, all of those who are closest to him. And to show us what they are left with, we have this interesting and unique story about this man in his nightshirt. Who is he? We do not know, but there have been many theories. A servant from the upper room who followed them, a secret follower, the rich young man, or the evangelist Mark himself. In my own headcanon, I do actually believe that this is an autobiographical insertion of the author himself. But regardless, when he abandons the Lord, he is left with absolutely nothing at all. So with their quarry in hand and no disciples to interfere, Jesus is taken to be tried by the religious authorities. Let's continue. They took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests, the elders, and the teachers of the law came together. Peter followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest. There he sat with the guards and warmed himself at the fire. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so they could put him to death, but they did not find any. Many testified falsely against him, but their statements did not agree. Then some stood up and gave false testimony against him. We heard him say, "I will destroy this temple made with human hands, and in 3 days will build another, not made with hands." Yet even then their testimony did not agree. Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, "Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. Again the high priest asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" "I am," said Jesus, "and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." The high priest tore his clothes. "Why do we need any more witnesses?" he asked. "You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" They all condemned him as worthy of death. Then some began to spit at him. They blindfolded him, struck him with their fists, and said, "Prophesy!" And the guards took him and beat him. It would have been late at night, well after midnight at this time, and so the Temple Mount would have been closed, so the Sanhedrin could not have met where they normally would in the chamber of hewn stone. So instead, they took Jesus all the way to Caiaphas' house, the high priest. And this is where we hear that they all gathered together, and yet this was, remember, the night of Passover, and so they shouldn't have been doing any work at all, and yet they still had this trial, or what they called a trial, anyway. We are also told that Peter did muster up some courage and followed at a distance, sitting out in the courtyard while they questioned his master inside. And Mark makes it clear that within the trial itself, they really have no clear evidence against Jesus. And under Jewish law, they would need at least 2 witnesses to corroborate a crime that someone had committed. And yet, we don't even see that. And this would have been very important, especially as they were trying to accuse him of a capital crime. Finally, the high priest questions him, and he remains silent. What does this silence say about Jesus? Again, this may continue to be a fulfillment of Isaiah 53. But Jesus is also the sacrificial lamb whose fate is already sealed. Perhaps he can be seen as Isaac, who is submissive to his father's plan. Yet here Jesus has no need to ask about the victim for the sacrifice. We know that Jesus had no illusions about the sincerity of the elders, or lack thereof. He had no respect for their authority, and therefore did not owe them any answers. But then the high priest asks him the right question. The question that Mark answered at the beginning of his gospel. The question that Peter got right, and that causes demons to tremble. Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? And Jesus says, I am. Ego eimi. A phrase that echoes the very name of God. And if that's not enough, Jesus says that he will be seated at the right hand of God, meaning that he shares the very power and authority of God. And the reaction of Caiaphas corresponds to his answer. He tears his garments, which in Leviticus is forbidden for the priest to do. But in many Near East cultures, it is a symbol of intense interior distress and pain. And he does so showing that what Jesus said was indeed blasphemous. And this is his reaction to such blasphemy. Not only did they condemn him to death because of this statement, but proceeded to insult, mock, and beat him. There was certainly nothing legal about this proceeding, ironic for how much they claim to respect the law. And while this was going on inside the house, meanwhile, Peter is outside, trying unsuccessfully to be invisible. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she looked closely at him. You also were with that Nazarene, Jesus, she said. But he denied it. I do not know or understand what you are talking about, he said, and went out into the entryway. When the servant girl saw him there, she said again to those standing around, This fellow is one of them. Again, he denied it. After a little while, those standing near said to Peter, Surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean. He began to call down curses, and he swore to them, I do not know this man you're talking about. Immediately the rooster crowed the second time. Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken to him. Before the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times. And he broke down and wept. Any credit we might have given Peter for not completely abandoning Jesus like the others quickly fades away as we see him crumble under pressure. First of all, he is here in what might be considered enemy territory in the high priest's courtyard. Even the servant girl speaks about Jesus in a derogatory manner, calling him the Nazarene. Remember, Nazareth was considered an insignificant and backwater town. And yet Peter responds by saying he has no idea what she's talking about. And he completely denies any knowledge of Jesus. But she persists, and she tries to get others to really call out who Peter is. What is her objective? Is she hoping to get Peter arrested as well? Or maybe to drive him out? Or maybe to have them beat him just like they beat his rabbi? But either way, Peter is becoming more afraid. And
fear leads to anger.
And when they recognize him as a Galilean, he certainly does get angry and begins to curse at them. Some manuscripts even say that it is his voice or dialect that gives him away, suggesting that those from Galilee would have had a distinct accent, which would have been likely. By this time, Peter hears the crowing of the rooster and remembers what Jesus told him at the supper. Jesus also told him to pray not to fall into temptation at Gethsemane. Can you imagine the guilt and pain that would have overcome him? He vehemently had told Jesus that he would never deny him. He would never betray him. And now, just as rigorously, he has denied him 3 times. Not much more needs to be said other than what Mark told us, that he broke down and wept. At the time when Jesus needed him the most, he failed him. He could not stand up for his Lord. I had mentioned earlier that I had visited the Holy Land when I was younger, and one of the most ironic sights, other than the Church of the Transfiguration, is a beautiful church called St. Peter and Gallicantu. It was built on the site of where the high priest's house would have been, and the word Gallicantu is Latin for cock's crow. Now, as a Catholic, I can laugh at this. What other institution would dedicate a building to commemorate the failure of one of their first leaders? And I mean failure with a capital F. Peter fails completely here. And considering he's the guy that we consider to be the first pope, consecrating a church that commemorates his sin is quite bold. And perhaps this is how we can tie this part of our Lord's Passion together. Peter had to fail in order to be aware of his inadequacy, his inability to thrive apart from the Lord. It is only in failure and darkness can one begin to see the need for salvation and seek the light. I remember struggling once, well, lots of times, but I remember this particular time during Lent. Now, I would typically give up or sacrifice something during these 40 days, and I found myself failing. Now, if this isn't a practice for you, think about perhaps a New Year's resolution and then failing to keep it before January is even finished. A priest told me that in failing, I probably learned more than I might have if I had persisted in my sacrifice. Because it was in that moment that I realized that I could not set out on what I wanted to do on my own. I could not persevere without the help of Christ. It was only through the Lord that I was able to really persist in this discipline. In fact, that becomes really the point of the discipline, realizing our need for Christ, realizing that we need Him for salvation. It's not something that we can do on our own. And now the point is not then just to give up and stop doing whatever we had planned to do, but to continue, but with the help of the Lord, to rely more on the strength of Christ rather than on my own. For as St. Paul says, it is when I am weak that I am strong. He is saying that those moments of weakness are where we find God's power and grace. It is precisely in those moments of pain, suffering, and doubt that we can lean on the prayer of Jesus in Gethsemane. We too can call God Abba, Father. For Jesus shares in our humanity, and as our brother, we too share the same Father. And that's why Jesus taught His disciples how to pray by begin with saying, Our Father. And so we too can really appreciate the power and agency of God the Father in our lives. Everything is possible with you. How much faith do we put in that statement? That we do have a God who acts within this world, and not just in biblical times, but today in our individual lives. All things are possible. But what about our suffering? In moments of grief, despair, anxiety, depression, hopelessness, confusion, addiction, temptation, and persecution, we might often pray, take this cup away from me. Lord, I don't want to deal with this right now. I can't do this. I'm afraid. I'm lost. I've hit rock bottom. Or maybe I'm just having a bad day. I need help. Perhaps you can remove this thorn, this pain that I feel, or give me another way to deal with it. And that help can come in so many ways. A person to talk to, whether a friend, mentor, or stranger. A new experience or way of thinking. A resurgence of faith. Even a failure that provides a lesson. And that's where the last part of the prayer comes in. Yet not what I will, but what you will. Oh, that's the tough one. That's the part we often forget to say. I don't always know what's best for me. I can't see the end of this tunnel, but I trust that God does, and that He will lead me through darkness and into the light. Sometimes we have to limp through Good Friday in order to dance on Easter Sunday. Thank you as always for joining me in this study. What wisdom do you have to share as we continue reading through the Passion of Christ? So until next time, keep praying, and God bless.